Stupendous as this disaster is, there is still a margin of survival. It may be worth remembering just how that we are not unique in looking upon vast calamity. Whatever the myths that have grown up about it, there can be no doubt that somewhere far back in our history there was a great flood. Those who survived that must have looked upon a disaster comparable in scale with this, and in some ways more formidable. But they cannot have despaired. They must have begun again, as we can begin again. Self-pity and a sense of high tragedy are going to build nothing at all. So, we'd better throw them out at once, for it is builders that we must become. And further to deflate any romantic dramatization, I would like to point out to you that this, even now, is not the worst that could have happened. I, and quite likely many of you, have spent most of our lives in expectation of something worse. And I still believe that if this had not happened to us, that worse thing would. From the 6th of August 1945, the margin of survival has narrowed appallingly. Indeed, 2 days ago, it was narrower than it is at this moment. If you need to dramatize, you could well take for your material the years succeeding 1945, when the path of safety started to shrink to a tightrope, along which we had to walk with our eyes deliberately closed to the depths beneath us. In any single moment of the years since then, the fatal slip might have been made. It is a miracle that it was not. It is a double miracle that can go on happening for years. But, sooner or later, that slip must have occurred. It would not have mattered whether it came through malice, carelessness, or sheer accident. The balance would have been lost, and the destruction let loose. How bad it would have been, we cannot say. How bad it could have been, well, there might have been no survivors. There might possibly have been no planet. And now contrast our situation. The Earth is intact, unscarred, still fruitful. It can provide us with food and raw materials. We have repositories of knowledge that can teach us to do anything that has been done before, though there are some things that may be better unremembered. And we have the means, the health, and the strength to begin to build again. He did not make a long speech, but it had effect. It must have made quite a number of the members of his audience begin to feel that perhaps they were at the beginning of something after all, rather than at the end of everything. In spite of his offering little but generalities, there was a more alert air in the place when he sat down. The colonel who followed him was practical and factual. He reminded us that for reasons of health it would be advisable for us to get away from all built-up areas as soon as practicable, which was expected to be about 1,200 hours on the following day. Almost all the primary necessities, as well as extras enough to give a reasonable standard of comfort, had now been collected. In considering our stocks, our aim must be to make ourselves as nearly independent of outside sources as possible for a minimum of 1 year. We should spend that period in virtually a state of siege. There were no doubt many things we should all like to take besides those on our lists, but they would have to wait until the medical staff, and here the girl on the committee blushed deeply, considered it safe for parties to leave isolation and fetch them. As for the scene of our isolation, the committee had given it considerable thought, and bearing in mind the desiderata of compactness, self-sufficiency and detachment, had come to the conclusion that a country boarding school, or failing that some large country mansion, would best serve our purposes. Whether the committee had in fact not yet decided on any particular place, or whether the military notion that secrecy has some intrinsic value persisted in the colonel's mind, I cannot say. But I have no doubt that his failure to name the place, or even the probable locality, was the gravest mistake made that evening. At the time, however, his practical manner made a further reassuring effect. As he sat down, Michael rose again. He spoke encouragingly to the girl, and then introduced her. It had, he said, been one of our greatest worries that we had no one among us with medical knowledge. Therefore, it was with great relief that he welcomed Miss Burr. It was true that she did not hold medical degrees with impressive letters, but she did have high nursing qualifications. For himself, he thought that knowledge recently attained might be worth more than degrees acquired years ago. The girl, blushing again, said a little piece about her determination to carry the job through, and ended a trifle abruptly with the information that she would inoculate us all against a variety of things before we left the hall. A small sparrow-like man, whose name I did not catch, rubbed it in that the health of each was the concern of all, and that any suspicion of illness should be reported at once, since the effects of a contagious disease among us would be serious. When he had finished, Sandra rose and introduced us to the last speaker of the group, Dr. E. H. Vorlus, DSc of Edinburgh, Professor of Sociology at the University of Kingston. The white-haired man walked to the desk. He stood there a few moments with his fingertips resting upon it, and his head bent down as if he were studying it. Those behind regarded him carefully with a trace of anxiety. The colonel leaned over to whisper something to Michael, who nodded without taking his eyes off the doctor. The old man looked up. He passed a hand over his hair. "My friends," he said, "I think I may claim to be the oldest among you. In nearly 70 years I have learned and had to unlearn many things, though not nearly so many as I could have wished. But if in the course of a long study of man's institutions one thing has struck me more than their stubbornness, it is their variety. Well, indeed, do the French say, autre temps, autre mœurs. We must all see, if we pause to think, that one kind of community's virtue may well be another kind of community's crime, that what is frowned upon here may be considered laudable elsewhere, that customs condemned in one century are condoned in another. And we must also see that in each community and each period there is a widespread belief in the moral rightness of its own customs. Now, clearly, since many of these beliefs conflict, they cannot all be right in an absolute sense. The most judgment one can pass on them, if one has to pass judgment at all, is to say that they have at some period been right for those communities that hold them. It may be that they still are, but it frequently is found that they are not, and that the communities who continue to follow them blindly without heed to changed circumstances do so to their own disadvantage, perhaps to their ultimate destruction. The audience did not perceive where the introduction might be leading. It fidgeted. Most of it was accustomed, when it encountered this kind of thing, to turn the radio off at once. Now it felt trapped. The speaker decided to make himself clearer. "Thus," he continued, "you would not expect to find the same manners, customs, and forms in a penurious Indian village living on the edge of starvation as you would in, say, Mayfair. Similarly, the people in a warm country where life is easy are going to differ quite a deal from the people of an overcrowded, hard-working country as to the nature of the principal virtues. In other words, different environments set different standards. I point this out to you because the world we knew is gone, finished. The conditions which framed and taught us our standards have gone with it. Our needs are now different, and our aims must be different. If you want an example, I would suggest to you that we have all spent the day indulging with perfectly easy consciences in what 2 days ago would have been housebreaking and theft. With the old pattern broken, we have now to find out what mode of life is best suited to the new. We have not simply to start building again. We have to start thinking again, which is much more difficult and far more distasteful. Man remains physically adaptable to a remarkable degree, but it is the custom of each community to form the minds of its young in a mould, introducing a binding agent of prejudice. The result is a remarkably tough substance, capable of withstanding successfully even the pressure of many innate tendencies and instincts. In this way, it has been possible to produce a man who, against all his basic sense of self-preservation, will voluntarily risk death for an ideal. But also in this way is produced the dolt who is sure of everything and knows what is right. In the time now ahead of us, a great many of these prejudices we have been taught will have to go, or be radically altered. We can accept and retain only one primary prejudice, and that is that the race is worth preserving. To that consideration, all else will, for a time at least, be subordinate. We must look at all we do with a question in mind: is this going to help our race survive, or will it hinder us? If it will help, we must do it, whether or not it conflicts with the ideas in which we were brought up. If not, we must avoid it, even though the omission may clash with our previous notions of duty and even of justice. It will not be easy. Old prejudices die hard. The simple rely on a bolstering mass of maxim and precept. So do the timid, so do the mentally lazy, and so do all of us, more than we imagine. Now that the organization has gone, our ready reckoners for conduct within it no longer give the right answers. We must have the moral courage to think and to plan for ourselves. He paused to survey his audience thoughtfully. Then he said, "There is one thing to be made quite clear to you before you decide to join our community. It is that those of us who start on this task will all have our parts to play. The men must work, the women must have babies. Unless you can agree to that, there can be no place for you in our community." After an interval of dead silence, he added, "We can afford to support a limited number of women who cannot see, because they will have babies who can see. We cannot afford to support men who cannot see. In our new world, then, babies become very much more important than husbands." For some seconds after he stopped speaking, silence continued. Then isolated murmurs grew quickly into a general buzz. I looked to Josella. To my astonishment, she was grinning impishly. "What do you find funny about this?" I asked, a trifle shortly. "People's expressions, mostly," she replied. I had to admit it as a reason. I looked round the place and then across at Michael. His eyes were moving from one section to another of the audience as he tried to sum up their reaction. "Michael's looking a bit anxious," I observed. "He should worry," said Josella. "If Brigham Young could bring it off in the middle of the 19th century, this ought to be a pushover." "What a crude young woman you are at times," I said. "Were you in on this before?" "Not exactly, but I'm not quite dumb, you know. Besides, while you were away, someone drove in a bus with most of these blind girls on board. They all came from some institution. I said to myself, why collect them from there when you could gather up thousands in a few streets round here? The answer, obviously, was that A, being blind before this happened, they'd been trained to do work of some kind, and B, they were all girls. The deduction wasn't terribly difficult." I said. "Depends on one's outlook, I suppose. I must say, it wouldn't have struck me. Do you—" "Shh, she told me, as a quietness came over the hall. A tall, dark, purposeful-looking youngish woman had risen. While we waited, she appeared to have a mouth not made to open, but later it did. "Are we to understand," she inquired, using a kind of carbon-steel voice, "are we to understand that the last speaker is advocating free love?" And she sat down with spine-jarring decision. Dr. Vorlus smoothed back his hair as he regarded her. "I think the questioner must be aware that I never mentioned love, free, bought or bartered. Will she please make her question clearer?" The woman stood up again. "I think the speaker understood me. I'm asking if he suggests the abolition of the marriage law." "The laws we knew have been abolished by circumstances. It now falls to us to make laws suitable to the conditions and to enforce them, if necessary." "There is still God's law, and the law of decency." "Madam, Solomon had 300, or was it 500 wives, and God did not apparently hold that against him. A Mohammedan preserves rigid respectability with 3 wives. These are matters of local custom. Just what our laws in these matters and in others will be is for us all to decide later for the greatest benefit of the community. This committee, after discussion, has decided that if we are to build a new state of things and avoid a relapse into barbarism, which is an appreciable danger, we must have certain undertakings from those who wish to join us. Not one of us is going to recapture the conditions we have lost. What we offer is a busy life in the best conditions we can contrive, and the happiness which will come of achievement against odds. In return, we ask willingness and fruitfulness. There is no compulsion. The choice is yours. Those to whom our offer does not appeal are at perfect liberty to go elsewhere and start a separate community on such lines as they prefer. But I would ask you to consider very carefully whether or not you do hold a warrant from God to deprive any woman of the happiness of carrying out her natural functions. The discussion which followed was a rambling affair, descending frequently to points of detail and hypothesis on which there could as yet be no answers. But there was no move to cut it short. The longer it went on, the less strangeness the idea would have. Josella and I moved over to the table where Nurse Burr had set up her paraphernalia. We took several shots in our arms, and then sat down again to listen to the wrangling. "How many of them will decide to come, do you think?" I asked her. She glanced round. "Nearly all of them, by the morning," she said. I felt doubtful. There was a lot of objecting and questioning going on. Josella said, "If you were a woman who was going to spend an hour or two before you went to sleep tonight, considering whether you would choose babies and an organisation to look after you, or adherence to a principle which might quite likely mean no babies and no one to look after you, you'd not really be very doubtful, you know. And after all, most women want babies anyway. The husband is just what Dr. Vorlers might call the local means to the end." "That's rather cynical of you." "If you really think that's cynical, you must be a very sentimental character. I'm talking about real women, not those in the magazine, movie, make-believe world." "Oh," I said. She sat pensively a while, and gradually acquired a frown. At last she said, "The thing that worries me is how many will they expect? I like babies all right, but there are limits." After the debate had gone on raggedly for an hour or so, it was wound up. Michael asked that the names of all those willing to join in his plan should be left in his office by 10 o'clock the next morning. The Colonel requested all who could drive a lorry to report to him by 700 hours, and the meeting broke up. Josella and I wandered out of doors. The evening was mild. The light on the tower was again stabbing hopefully into the sky. The moon had just risen clear of the museum roof. We found a low wall and sat on it, looking into the shadows of the square garden and listening to the faint sound of the wind in the branches of the trees there. We smoked a cigarette each, almost in silence. When I reached the end of mine, I threw it away and drew a breath. "Josella," I said. "Hmm?" she replied, scarcely emerging from her thoughts. "Josella," I said again, those babies, I'd be sort of terribly proud and happy if they could be mine as well as yours." She sat quite still for a moment, saying nothing. Then she turned her head. The moonlight was glinting on her fair hair, but her face and eyes were in shadow. I waited with a hammered and slightly sick feeling inside me. She said with surprising calm, "Thank you, Bill, dear. I think I would too." I sighed. The hammering did not ease up much, and I saw that my hand was trembling as it reached for hers. I didn't have any words for the moment. Josella, however, did. She said, "But it isn't quite as easy as that now." I was jolted. "What do you mean?" I asked. She said consideringly, "I think that if I were those people in there," she nodded in the direction of the tower, "I think that I should make a rule. I should divide us up into lots. I should say every man who marries a sighted girl must take on 2 blind girls as well. I'm pretty sure that's what I should do." I stared at her face in the shadow. "You don't mean that," I protested. "I'm afraid I do, Bill." "But look here, don't you think they might have some idea like that in their minds, from what they've been saying?" "Not unlikely," I conceded. "But if they make the rule, that's one thing. I don't see—" "You mean you don't love me enough to take on 2 other women as well?" I swallowed. I also objected. "Look here, this is all crazy. It's unnatural. What you're suggesting—" She put up a hand to stop me. "Just listen to me, Bill. I know it sounds a bit startling at first, but there's nothing crazy about it. It's all quite clear, and it's not very easy. All this," She waved her hand around. "It's done something to me. It's like suddenly seeing everything differently. And one of the things I think I see is that those of us who get through are going to be much nearer to one another, more dependent on one another, more like a tribe than we ever were before. All day long, as we went about, I've been seeing unfortunate people who are going to die very soon. And all the time I've been saying to myself, there but for the grace of God. And then I've told myself, this is a miracle. I don't deserve anything better than any of these people. But it has happened. Here I still am, so now it's up to me to justify it. Somehow it's made me feel closer to other people than I have ever done before. That's made me keep wondering all the time what I can do to help some of them. You see, we must do something to justify that miracle, Bill. I might have been any of these blind girls. You might have been any of these wandering men. There's nothing big we can do. But if we try to look after just a few and give them what happiness we can, we shall be paying back a little, just a tiny part of what we owe. You do see that, don't you, Bill? I turned it over in my mind for a minute or more. I think, I said, that's the queerest argument I've heard today, if not ever. And yet it's right, isn't it, Bill? I know it's right. I tried to put myself in the place of one of those blind girls, and I know. We hold the chance of as full a life as they can have for some of them. Shall we give it them as part of our gratitude, or shall we simply withhold it on account of the prejudices we've been taught? That's what it amounts to. I sat silently for a while. I had not a moment's doubt that Josella meant every word she said. I ruminated a little on the ways of purposeful, subversive-minded women like Florence Nightingale and Elizabeth Fry. You can't do anything with such women, and they so often turn out to have been right after all. "Very well," I said at last, "if that's the way you think it ought to be. But I hope—" She cut me short. "Oh, Bill, I knew you'd understand. Oh, I'm glad, so very glad. You've made me so happy." After a time, "I hope—" I began again. Josella patted my hand. "You won't need to worry at all, my dear. I shall choose 2 nice, sensible girls." "Oh," I said. We went on sitting there on the wall, hand in hand, looking at the dappled trees, but not seeing them very much. At least, I wasn't. Then in the building behind us someone started up a gramophone, playing a Strauss waltz. It was painfully nostalgic as it lilted through the empty courtyard. For an instant the road before us became the ghost of a ballroom, a swirl of colour with a moon for a crystal chandelier. Josella slid off the wall. With her arms outstretched, her wrists and fingers rippling, her body swaying, she danced, light as a thistledown, in a big circle in the moonlight. She came round to me, her eyes shining and her arms beckoning. And we danced, on the brink of an unknown future, to an echo from a vanished past. Chapter 8. Frustration. I was walking through an unknown deserted city where a bell rang dismally, and a sepulchral, disembodied voice called in the emptiness, "The beast is loose! Beware, the beast is loose!" When I woke to find that a bell really was ringing. It was a handbell that jangled with a brassy double clatter so harsh and startling that for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then, as I sat up still bemused, there came a sound of voices calling, "Fire!" I jumped just as I was from my blankets and ran into the corridor. There was a smell of smoke there, a noise of hurried feet, doors banging. Most of the sound seemed to come from my right, where the bell kept on clanging and the frightened voices were calling, so it was that way I turned and ran. A little moonlight filtered in through tall windows at the end of the passage, relieving the dimness just enough for me to keep to the middle of the way and avoid the people who were feeling their way along the walls. I reached the stairs. The bell was still clanging in the hall below. I made my way down as fast as I could through smoke that grew thicker. Near the bottom I tripped and fell forward. The dimness became a sudden darkness in which a light burst like a cloud of needles. And that was all. The first thing was an ache in my head. The next was a glare when I opened my eyes. At the first blink it was as dazzling as a Klieg light. But when I started again and edged the lids up more cautiously, it turned out to be only an ordinary window, and grimy at that. I knew I was lying on a bed, but I did not sit up to investigate further. There was a piston pounding away in my head that discouraged any kind of movement. So I lay there quietly and studied the ceiling, until I discovered that my wrists were tied together. That snapped me out of my lethargy, in spite of the thumping head. I found it a very neat job, not painfully tight, but perfectly efficient. Several turns of insulated wire on each wrist, and a complex knot on the far side where it was impossible for me to reach it with my teeth. I swore a bit and looked round. The room was small, and save for the bed on which I lay, empty. "Hey!" I called. "Anybody around here?" After half a minute or so there was a shuffle of feet outside. The door was opened and a head appeared. It was a small head with a tweed cap on the top of it. It had a stringy-looking choker beneath, and a dark unshavenness across its face. It was not turned straight at me, but in my general direction. "Hello, Cock," it said, amiably enough. "So, you've come too, have you? Hang on a bit, and I'll get you a cup of char." And it vanished again. The instruction to hang on was superfluous, but I did not have to wait long. In a few minutes he returned, carrying a wire-handled can with some tea in it. "Where are you?" he said. "Straight ahead of you, on the bed," I told him. He groped forward with his left hand until he found the foot of the bed. Then he felt his way around it and held out the can. "Here you are, chum. It'll taste a bit funny like, 'cause old Charlie put a shot of rum in it, but I reckon you'll not mind that." I took it from him, holding it with some difficulty between my bound hands. It was strong and sweet, and the rum hadn't been stinted. The taste might be queer, but it worked like the elixir of life itself. "Thanks," I said. "You're a miracle worker. My name's Bill." His, it seemed, was Alf. "What's the line, Alf? What goes on here?" I asked him. He sat down on the side of the bed and held out a packet of cigarettes with a box of matches. I took one, lit his first, then my own, and gave him back the box. "It's this way, mate," he said. "You know there was a bit of a shindy up at the university yesterday morning? Maybe you was there." I told him I'd seen it. "Well, after that lark, Coker, he's the chap that did the talking, he got kind of peeved. 'OK,' he says, nasty like. 'They've asked for it. I put it to 'em fair and square in the first place, now they're going to take what's coming to 'em.' Well, we'd met up with a couple of other fellas and one old girl what can still see, and they fixed it all up between 'em. He's a lad, that Coker." "You mean he framed the whole business? There wasn't any fire or anything?" I asked. "Fire? My Aunt Fanny. What they done was fix up a tripwire or two, light a lot of paper and sticks in the hall, and start in ringing the old bell. We reckoned that them as could see would be the first along on account of there being a bit of light still from the moon, and sure enough they was. Coker and another chap was giving them the KO as they tripped, and passing them along to some of us chaps to carry out to the lorry. Simple as kiss your hand." I said ruefully. "Sounds efficient, that Coker. How many of us mugs fell into that little trap?" "I'd say we got a couple of dozen, though it turned out as 5 or 6 of them was blinded. When we'd loaded up about all we'd room for in the lorry, we beat it, and left the rest to sort themselves out." Whatever view Coker took of us, it was clear that Alf bore us no animosity. He appeared to regard the whole affair as a bit of sport. I found it a little too painful to class it so, but I mentally raised my hat to Alf. I'd a pretty good idea that in his position I'd be lacking the spirit to think of anything as a bit of sport. I finished the tea and accepted another cigarette from him. "And what's the programme now?" I asked him. "Coker's idea is to make us all up into parties and put one of you with each party. You to look after the scrounging and kind of act as the eyes of the rest, like. Your job would be to help us keep going until somebody comes along to straighten this perishing lot out." "I see," I said. He cocked his head towards me. There weren't any flies on Alf. He'd caught more in my tone than I realised was there. "You reckon that's going to be a long time?" he said. "I don't know. What's Coker say?" Coker, it seemed, had not been committing himself to details. Alf had his own opinion, though. "If you ask me, I reckon there ain't nobody going to come. If there was, they'd have been here before this. Different if we was in some little town in the country, but London? Stands to reason they come here afore anywhere else. Nah, the way I see it, They ain't come yet, and that means they ain't never going to come. And that means there ain't nobody to come. God blimey. Who'd ever have thought it could happen like this? I didn't say anything. Alf wasn't the sort to be jollied with facile encouragements. "Reckon that's the way you see it too," he said after a bit. "It doesn't look so good," I admitted. "But there still is a chance, you know. People from somewhere abroad." He shook his head. "They'd have come before this. They'd have had loudspeaker cars round the streets telling us what to do before this. Nah, chum, we've had it. There ain't nobody nowhere to come. That's the fact of it."